Hi everyone. Here is a in-depth look at the new PM18 with the Season 2 upgrade at Watkins Glen boot. Got an 83 Fahrenheit track temp at 5:05 in the afternoon. SAP is a 42.0. So the most important thing when you're coming into turn 1 is don't dive too deep under the brakes. A lot of people think that turn 1 at Watkins is really about braking in late, but I've never found it is. The most important thing you can do is hit the apex, get on the throttle and get up the hill. So I'm getting on the brakes in between the 200 and the 100 meter marker, or foot, whatever that is, the 200 and 100 marker, and making sure you bring the car in and clip the apex. Now you do want to trail the car in a little bit because I've got a fair bit of steering lock in. Just help to glide it into the apex while you're still releasing the brake. Then the second you clip that apex, or a little bit before it even, you go full throttle. And that drives the car out into this empty space out here and allows you to bring it over. And with the front left, just getting on that section between the tarmac and the grass. Now the opposite effect, if you go too deep in here, you miss this apex. People often, well, I do it too, so I'm not just saying other people, but if you have broke too late, you probably can't get the front right into this apex, and therefore you're having to get the car rotated before you pull on throttle, and you're actually adding track length the whole way through this corner. So you compromise yourself here, but it also compromises your run up the hill. The best bet through this corner is always to brake early, make sure you hit the apex, then accelerate hard out. Immediately back on the throttle. You can, if you broke a little bit too early, just to make sure that you hit the apex, get the front right up a little bit on the curb, but I tend to prefer not to. I just find it can unsettle the car. This car does seem to be able to ride the curbs reasonably well though. Now you've got a nice good drive up here, and if you're using your optimal delta, you'll find that you're gaining time this whole way, as opposed if you're braking a bit later and missing the front apex, missing the first apex. Now you want to move to the left hand side of the track. Now you're slowing the car down a little bit. I'm not really using the braking marker. What I'm doing is just keeping my eye on this inside apex here, because the car has to go up and on that curb completely. So your line is basically with the front right getting very close to the grass and on that curb, then you turn immediately to the left to get both the inside curbs whilst modulating the throttle. Now this is a little bit warmer track than I had been testing in earlier. I was testing in something about 78 Fahrenheit track, and I was finding I was just getting a little bit of understeer in the midpoint of this bus stop section, therefore having to come out of the throttle a little bit to keep the car online. But what you really don't want is oversteer on entry and then through the middle of this corner. If you're having to correct the car that is sliding at the rear, then I find it's very easy to make it go offline. You're having to wait to get back on the throttle. I just set my car up to be quite stable through this section. So turning in, get the first apex nicely and the second, and just kind of wavering with the throttle. You're wanting to push the car through here, but you don't want to give it too much that it forces it into understeer. So you're just kind of feeling how the rotation's going and adjusting your throttle to compensate. Gets the next apex. It was probably, if anything, a little bit too deep onto this exit right-hand curbing. I would have liked it to more tuck to the left. But it was still quite good. It didn't grab any grass or anything or unsettle it too much, and it ran to a nice line in the middle of the track. Yeah, if it wanted to be a little bit more optimal, I would have liked to get the front left a bit more up on this inside curbing instead of just running a little bit wide. Just a little bit wide of it and compromise the exit, but you know, within a tenth. So you're moving out to this middle section of the track. You basically can never enter from the full left here just because it takes too long to get the car over to the left and flat and then turn it back in. But it's very important in this section of the track to make sure that you get the front right up onto the curb. You don't want to have it kind of lazily hanging in the middle of the corner, which both adds track distance but also means that you're not maximizing the angle through the corner. So you're wanting to really make sure you bring it into the corner and get the front right up on this curb and just hold it through here. And as you can see, I'm kind of modulating the throttle just to hold that line. I'm not quite confident. Now, this actually does vary. Other people like to do it differently. But I don't like the car to go up on that exit left-hand curb because I find it grabs it and just slows your momentum. So when you're holding the car to this right line, you're doing it with the intention of keeping a fairly narrow line so that when you exit out, you don't go up and get caught up on this curb. Again, I've seen other people carry heaps of exit speed and go over that curb and they're fine, but for me, it's just how I like to do it. Now, this corner here, you're preparing by moving to the far right for entry into the apex. Now, you want to bring the car into a tight apex. Now, we'll trail the brake in a little bit on entry just to get it, you've got a bit of rotation, not a huge amount, but you don't want to overdo the car on entry here. It's tempting to carry a bit too much speed, but the primary goal of this corner should be to get it on this inside curb and just kind of follow it around. That curb guides you nicely to the point where you can go full throttle and exit the corner. About here, and then just slowly straighten up, and then you'll exit out and clip the right-hand curb as you've used all the track and you've gotten on the throttle just as you can to go full throttle at the right point. Now here's one of my favorite corners on this track, but it's also very difficult to get right. This is another corner. You want to take about a medium apex. I don't like to bring the car early in and hold the apex. I find it's too long on the inside, but you also don't really want to grab a really late apex because I tend to find you're running too wide of a line if you hit it. So you want to run about a medium line, bring the car in, hit about a medium apex like that and hug the apex for a little while, and then slowly accelerate out to the outside of the track. If you're too deep under braking here or carry too much momentum, you can find the car moves up to about the middle of the track and you're having to really fight it to get it back down to the apex. This costs you time because you can't accelerate at full throttle early enough, but it also adds distance. And although it does straighten the exit a little bit, so you can kind of compensate a little bit with that, it's always more optimal to keep it on a medium line and just get into that apex as opposed to running a bit of a high line from braking too late or carrying too much speed in. If anything, it'll feel a little slow. You feel like you can just carry a bit more speed and you're being restrained, but that slowness on entry brings you into the right line and allows you to exit the corner properly. Now this last corner here, this is very good for trail braking. So you're really needing to make sure you get the car from a wide exit into the apex to exit out. And you do that through trail braking the car down to quite a low speed and making sure you clip the apex. So brake quite hard. Just applying a little bit more brake. I actually thought I trailed it a bit closer into the apex initially, but I just get the car properly slowed down with a little bit of overlap and then make sure it's properly slowed and doesn't overshoot this corner. If you carry too much speed in here, you kind of run a bit left of the apex, you run wide, and that does cost you quite a bit of time. You really need to get to a narrow apex here so that you can exit out and get on the throttle early. And because I've got right up close to the apex, I can get immediately on the throttle and push the car out. This is one of those corners that it's very easy just to carry a bit too much speed in. And your the front right will just track along here, maybe even half a meter wide the apex, but it just ends up costing you a tenth or so, just because you can't get in the throttle as early and you're adding track distance. Now this corner is actually set up here is quite important because you want to be able to carry a lot of speed in, but if you do that, you're going to get a lot of weight balance shift on the front of the car, and when you go to hit the throttle, it's going to not be very happy and get on throttle oversteer through here, which can actually mean you have to take off steering lock and you run wide. You see in the races, a lot of people grab this outside wall here, and it's often because they've got mid-corner throttle and they're trying to manage it, but that just makes the car run off course and into the barrier. Even in the old Pro Mazda, it was quite a common corner to experience that kind of oversteer. So carry quite a lot of speed into the corner, just hugging into the tight apex, and then immediately just try to get back on the throttle, push the car out. I've got the car set up with quite a soft rear end, so it's actually it's got quite a lot of rear grip, so it allows me to get on the throttle through here hard and not worry too much about oversteer. It gets a little bit, but I'm just kind of modulating it until I can get the car a bit straighter and get full throttle. Then it drives it nicely out. Now this left-hand corner here, since the car post-update, it is not full throttle. So you are going to have to modulate just a little bit. It's more just a safety lift if anything, but if you find you can bring the car down to like 90–80% throttle, then it will just make it track through the corner nicely. And as you get a bit more comfortable with how the car tracks, sort of minimizing your steering input so you can let it run a bit of a wider line to minimize the oversteer, then you can start going through there and releasing the throttle just a little bit less and less. And if you have your delta up, you'll notice you're going green and just gaining a few hundredths because you've just taken a little bit less throttle off there. But I've got a lot of wing on the car and it still is not going through their full throttle. That's just a characteristic, but it's not too bad. I find if you use too much throttle, you're getting oversteer of anything. It's not understeering, and I frankly prefer oversteer in this situation because it's not going to push the car wide off there. You just sense the rear end starting to move a little bit, and then you reduce the throttle a tiny bit. So through here, you want to get out and get the car flat on the left-hand side for the perfect entry, and you really need to get a tight apex here. So I'm turning in fairly early, grabbing the apex with the front right wheel, taking the narrow line. You don't want to get the car too much up on this outside curb because it will drain a lot of momentum and can cost you half a tenth or a tenth on the run down to the straight. So you use the curb with the front left a little bit, but it's mostly important that you just don't carry too much momentum in here. You really want to get the car slowed properly and pointed to that early apex, and then the sooner you get at the apex, you can pull the throttle back on. Then you run wide and over the finish line. And that was a 42.0. Now, I must admit, this new update Pro Mazda 18, PM18, sorry, I think is a pretty big improvement over the last car. There are a lot of people that don't like it, and I can understand why. I feel that whatever they've done with the tyres has moved a bit of the balance shift more to the front of the car, and you definitely do have to modulate the throttle and control the rear end a bit, but I find ultimately that can still allow you to generate pace, whereas if the front end is just dragging across the track and not rotating, there's not as much you can do about it. This car is a bit snappier at the rear compared to the last car, but the compromise is that you get a better front end. And I feel they've also done something with the brakes. The brakes I'm not quite as confident with the old Pro Mazda, which I could put on a ton of brake pressure and still not lock them, but I'm just finding I can trail brake it into the corners just a bit more comfortably, whereas before this update, it was quite difficult to trail brake this car because it would just catch and lock the front or the rears, so you were forever fighting it. This car, I find it flows better. You can actually flow it smoothly as you decrease the brake pressure into the apex, and it's not locking constantly. So it just feels like a nicer rhythm. The one thing that will bother some people is over the race distance. If the rear starts to get looser, particularly if you're already running quite a loose qualifying set, that could be a problem. But the way we're just going to have to deal with that is running the car fairly conservative at the start of the race and just knowing that it will get a bit looser as the race goes on. I haven't actually done a race distance in it, but I have heard people in the forums saying that that is the case. And I know when they updated the Formula 3 to the new tyre model, it definitely got looser over the race, but it was usually doing it within the first 5 laps, whereas here, apparently it's happening towards the end. So we're basically all going to have to learn to redo the setups. The stock iRacing setups are excellent now. If you are a driver with even novice to intermediate level, you could load one of those iRacing sets with track-specific downforce and be right on the pace. I mean, there's still ultimately going to be a few tenths to be gained, but they're excellent sets, and realistically anyone could start from there and just slightly tweak the car, which is a very good thing to have. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys on the track maybe.